Hello. I know most of you, so I won't introduce myself too much. But I am Sarah Clement. I am an associate professor at the Fenner School. So here, I'm also the head of the IDEA committee, and I would like us to have more sort of idea-themed talks. I asked some people, wasn't able to get a speaker. So in the absence of being able to do that, I'm going to talk about some of my urban greening work. One thing that I'm also going to be doing at Fenner is to be involved in the Singapore field class that's actually about kind of urban sustainability. So this is the European, much more not low tech, well, it's pretty low tech, very small scale as compared to the stuff that you'll get in a lot of other places, but we'll talk all about that. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of, let me make sure that it's going to move. All right. And for everyone who does not know, I have a giant red box. If you're online, that's how I have to talk into the microphone. So we'll talk about what nature-based solutions are. I'm not just going to talk about nature-based solutions, but this is a very popular framing at the moment and how they might sustainably transform cities. And then because nature-based solutions really have this emphasis on democratic principles, equality, access, and inclusion, I'm going to be questioning that. That's going to be the main theme. And then I'm going to test whether or not this big rhetoric that we have around nature-based solutions is actually evident in reality. So the IUCN is really the organization, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature, big global NGO. They're the ones who coined this term in 2002, and they're the ones who have developed like global standard, global principles, and guidance for how to implement nature-based solutions. They come much more from the nature perspective. So we're actually protecting, sustainably managing, or restoring ecosystems to adapt to societal challenges, while also providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Whereas the EU has really taken it on to it being more like solutions inspired by nature. It can be using nature, but it's inspired by nature. And it's very like using nature to solve problems and doing it in an innovative and effective way. And effective is supposed to mean resource effective. And they also fund it out of their innovation and economic portfolio rather than the environment portfolio. So it's a very different focus than the IUCN. However, the EU is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, global investors in nature-based solutions. They don't just invest in them in Europe, they invest in them all over the world. So the idea of nature-based solutions, pretty much everyone here will know, if you look at that previous slide, ecosystem-based adaptation, green infrastructure, a lot of you will be familiar with that, ecosystem services, they all kind of conceptually fit within nature-based solutions. And then there's all sorts of things that you would also know about, like sustainable urban drainage systems and other, ecological concepts that all fit under this umbrella of nature-based solutions. But the difference is supposed to be that nature-based solutions focus on solving challenges. So solutions, we've got challenges, we've got solutions, and nature provides the solution. The idea is that they will be able to transform places. In this case, we're talking about cities. And especially because those 12 challenges that I have listed there, those are the ones that the EU says that they can address. So climate resilience, enhancing biodiversity, participatory planning and governance, which is a big part of what we're talking about today, natural and climate hazards, air quality, social justice, social cohesion, new economic opportunities, green jobs, water management, health and well-being, place regeneration, knowledge building for sustainable urban transformation, and green space management, which is, they almost gave up on the sexiness of the term there. Because the rest of them are like, wow, we're going to do all of these things. But the idea is that you have, there's a focus on both the governance inputs when developing nature-based solutions, as well as the outcomes. So they should be sort of co-produced and co-designed, and they should be, in addition to solving all of our environmental problems, solving our social social challenges, and our sort of crisis in democracy. By the way, in this, I'm not going to talk a lot about very specific results, because I've published so many papers on these different projects that if you're interested, I will also send you these slides and you can look at the papers for detailed results. But because we're focusing on a specific theme, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty. I also do want to say, though, that although I'm going to be talking about Europe and mainly the UK today, Australia is using this badging now. The badging is coming from everywhere. You know, World Economic Forum is loving it. You get a lot of the foreign aid agencies are really loving it. We've got it in the Nature Positive Plan. And this is why I say also that you all know what nature-based solutions are, even if you might not call them that. So, you know, they're now saying that the biodiversity stewardship packages, that those are nature-based solutions, financing solutions for nature, restoring coastal blue carbon ecosystems. And that's a huge example, right, for the natural hazards. One is restoring coastal ecosystems to build resilience to natural hazards. So the IUCN, who are the ones that have developed this concept, they have a series of principles and guidance, but then they also have a global nature-based solution standard. The project that I'm going to talk about today, Urban Greenup, well, one of the projects that I'm going to talk about today, Urban Greenup, is one of the first places in the world to actually apply this global standard to. It's a self-assessment tool to actually look at whether or not we meet all of these principles. Don't need to read all of these. Some of you probably already have been while I've been talking, but the big one to think about is inclusive governance. It's right there in the global standard that if you're going to have nature-based solutions, they need to have inclusive governance. And underneath those, there's a whole bunch of different indicators. Well, there's 5 different indicators that look at things that are, you know, you have to engage with stakeholders who are directly and indirectly affected by the nature-based solutions. Decision-making processes have to respond to the rights and interests of all participating and affected stakeholders. And that includes Indigenous stakeholders. They draw specific attention to that. And there's a bunch of other ones, but it's a huge focus if you look at, and I will show you the assessment later. And it's an area that I think a lot of these are going to fall down on. So this looks amazing. Nature, we all love nature. We all love solving problems. So what I wanted to talk about today is whether or not the rhetoric matches reality. And this, Medellin, I never know how to say the name of the city properly. Anyone want to help? Medellin in Colombia? Is it? Medellin? They're one of the cities, actually, that's part of our Urban Greenup project. So this project has been the bane of my existence for the last 7 years. It's done now, but it was a huge, huge investment. There was at least like 23 million euros, and that's just from the EU, and then you had co-investment from the cities. But most of that money went to the front-runner cities, which we'll touch on later, and not the follower cities. And then there's like this network of dozens of global cities as well. So there's a lot of literature published on nature-based solutions. And the stuff on nature-based solutions specifically, and now I'm not talking about some of those older concepts like green infrastructure, sustainable urban drainage systems. A lot of the stuff that's written on nature-based solutions is completely without empirical data. It's rarely tested. So one of the things I really appreciate about what the EU is doing is they're actually investing in putting in the nature-based solutions and testing whether or not they live up to the hype, basically. So this was not a research project. There was basically just me and one other grumpy academic. And there's a few other academics involved at various stages, but we were amongst the only academics involved in this project because this was a demonstration project, not a research project, where we actually monitored baseline conditions, put in the interventions, and then monitored the effects afterwards. And of course, that also included, because I'm a governance researcher, a sort of action research component to actually look at how all of this is implemented. These are all obviously very different contexts, very different governance systems. There's some wild things that you learn about other laws. Like one of the big ones was in Izmir in Turkey. If they were to renature a concrete stream and someone fell into the stream, the planner who worked on it could actually be charged of criminal charges if somebody died. It was very interesting, a very interesting project. And the whole idea is that we were going to, with these front runner cities, develop a transferable approach for renaturing cities. So I'll walk you through Liverpool because I cannot walk you through all of the results. And this is really the one that I'm most familiar with because I was the PI for Liverpool on this. So Liverpool is a very good example of a place with extreme inequality in its accessible green space and its green space in general. So the most of the accessible GI is in 22% of the area, which is frankly the area where all the academics live in the south of the city. And that green space is very nice, but the rest of the green space isn't very nice at all. And Liverpool's been industrialized for a very, very long time. This is a World Heritage listed site. That is a lot of rubble and contamination, but they're kind of not allowed to build on it because of World Heritage status. So they have a lot of challenges in actually greening the city. So they've also had long-term austerity, and that means defunding a lot of the green space as well. So they also have significant environmental issues. So it seems it's a perfect place to actually do an experiment like this. So what you would do if you were implementing nature-based solutions in a reasonable way is you would take maps like this, where you've got what's the level of deprivation, what's the level of poor mental health. As you can see in Liverpool, it's the north of the city is the area with more deprivation, and the south of the city, well, especially this area, again, these are academics. This is literally where all of the academics live. They don't live anywhere else in the city. That area is fine. And once you start layering these over top of each other, you can see how you could come up with a very like GIS-based idea of where you would invest in green spaces. Now, this is over the whole Liverpool City region. And that's how you would do it if you were going to do a diagnosis and then decide how you might intervene. And you'd see like where are the places that have the most overlapping, what you might call pinch points, where there's the most issues overlapping, and how could we resolve those issues. However, we did not do that because the way that EU funding works is you have to pick areas before you even know if you've got the money. You've got to decide exactly what you're going to do in those areas, and they will not let you deviate from it. So the Liverpool City Council and Mersey Forest, the partners on this project, decided to go with areas of the city that, like, this is the very green area I already showed you, and then the kind of city center area where it was just going to be easy, and they knew that they would be able to do it. I won't go through all of these indicators, but I will say that we spent years developing the indicators, and there were hardly any of the social indicators. And even most of the biophysical indicators were really hard to get a good gauge on. As I say, if you want to learn more about those things, you can read some of the papers, and I also link to where the data dashboard is. So in practice, one thing I didn't point out, because it's not so relevant for the themes of this, but a key principle of nature-based solutions is that they should be at a landscape scale, which is very difficult in a city like Liverpool, where it's very hard to plant trees. In one of our demo areas, we surveyed it, and you could only have 8 places where you could physically plant a tree in the ground, just because there's so much stuff underneath the concrete. These are some of the interventions. One of my favorites here that was supposed to be a social intervention was a tiny forest bathing pod. If anyone knows about Japanese forest bathing, where when you actually closed it, this is me and my MPhil student, if you actually closed us inside of it, there's mirrors all around of it, and you actually did feel like you were inside of a forest. Whether or not that's really a nature-based solution, I'm not so sure. But she did a whole research project looking at what people thought about stuff like that. Longest green wall in Europe. That's one of the features of the project. We had citizen engagement through getting people to actually go on the bio blitzes and upload to iNaturalist. but there actually wasn't very much community engagement at all. And as you can probably guess, there was very little consultation with the community, because even if we wanted to plant trees in a different area, we would have to get a variation from the EU. Their auditing process is extreme. One of my colleagues bought a Tesco meal deal with one of those tiny little bottles of wine. She had to pay the £2 back at the end because they said they weren't going to pay for the wine. They are very, very pedantic. And you have to pay for internal auditors and external auditors. So when it came to the actual results, because the whole reason that you're supposed to be consulting with communities and thinking about co-designing with communities and co-producing with communities, and also following maybe what the spatial guidance tells you when you overlap them on top of each other, is so that you can have the biggest difference. We told them, as the grumpy academics on the team, that you probably wouldn't have that many improvements. Of course, you're going to see biodiversity improvements. You're going from concrete to a pollinator strip. You're going to get quite a few improvements. But what I will say is, if anyone starts looking at urban green up and it's like, wow, that sounds amazing, really look at those numbers, for example, up there are all modeled improvements. So one of the partners has their own modeling tool that they've created that they like to use. And every time we didn't have an indicator show very good results, they just use the modeling results instead from their own model. So I use this a lot in teaching to kind of show the students that maybe you should look at what's behind these calculations. So also one thing is that some of the public actually expressed concern on this, but because the city did not offer opportunities for engagement with design or engagement with the project very much at all, this came up only in a sort of public forum where somebody was yelling at a politician about this, about how they were worried that they were going to plant the wrong trees. It took them a while to figure out what he meant by the wrong trees, but this person had learned that, and it's true, it's correct, that if you plant trees that are a certain height, and if you plant them in certain areas, it can trap the particulates and actually make local air pollution worse. And that did happen in some of our areas. But also, our monitoring period conveniently coincided with 18 months of mostly lockdowns. So I would love to write a paper on how lockdowns had a bigger effect than any nature-based solution, but I don't think it would be very popular to write a paper like that. When I read about my project, and this comes up a lot, people will even send me little videos on Instagram of, look at this really cool nature-based solution in a place. And I'll be like, that's my project. That's not what it looks like. And I read like magazine things about it. And this is one of the brochures that they picked out at the end. And it talks about wide engagement of local residents in a variety of schemes, co-creation, improved to their mental health and well-being, wasn't measured. And we are winning awards constantly, which you might think, Sarah, you should be grateful. It's on your CV. I don't put it on my CV because it actually makes me mad. But we're actually currently, as of, yes, that's just a couple of days ago, one of the finalists for this Living Green for Climate Change Awards. Now, that's the global take, and this is like the promo of this project. It's not just for Liverpool. They do this for all of the projects. And it does look very impressive when you look at it online. Conveniently enough, though, they haven't published the social data. It just currently says we couldn't make it into a zip file, which doesn't really make sense to me. But I'm gonna message them about this. But this is some of the social data which we have published. We found that people had a general negative reaction to the nature-based solutions. What we found was people really did believe in the idea of nature-based solutions. They really believed that they could make the city better. And because a lot of the wider project kind of felt that, oh, it's just because people don't understand, they don't know what greening can do for them, and we just need to educate them. So they had one indicator that was social, and it was green intelligence awareness, which to this day, I still don't know what it means. But as far as I can gather from the metrics they were collecting, it's like how many people came to their events and how many people they reached on Twitter and LinkedIn. But what we actually found, and again, this was not just our project, although we were the only project that did this much data collection, that people didn't believe in the specific interventions that Urban Green Up was implementing, that they did any good for the challenges or for them. And if you saw, those pictures that I showed earlier, they're not exactly very accessible interventions. That long green wall, you can't even get close to it. I walk by it all the time and forget that it's there. Well, when I was in Liverpool. So I will talk about funding a little bit. I already mentioned that the funding issues, but and the EU told us after the project had already started, you have to co-create and co-design. And we said, great. So can we change the way that we designed our original interventions? No, not really. So that is a huge problem when you consider that they are probably the biggest global funder at the moment of nature-based solutions. They made us use this thing called the Eclipse framework. It's not really a framework. It's a report they wrote. And those indicators kind of were drawn from the Eclipse framework. All the projects have to use them. But there are no real meaningful metrics of democracy, participation, or inclusion in those. They're all, the typical surrogate metrics that are more like, again, how many people came to your event, not thinking about whether or not which is what we did, where it's kind of like, this is what we plan to do. And then people could comment on it, but it was like, we're going to still do that thing. It doesn't matter what you say. And they're really difficult to measure, right? However, you could genuinely measure things like accessibility. You could measure, how many more members of the public had access to quality green space. But those things weren't really measured as part of the project. And the Eclipse framework, which they force you to use, doesn't really have good metrics of that either. They mention these things, but they don't really give good guidance on that. So when you combine that idea, part of the problem as well is if you're not co-designing and co-creating, it's not just a fluffy idea to co-design and co-create. If you're not going to have funding at the end of the project, someone needs to have ownership over it. So they need to feel like they want to keep the green stuff in order for you to continue to have those benefits. Many of those nature-based solutions are going to be removed at the end of the project because Liverpool doesn't have the money to maintain them. And rather than doing things like in Liverpool, there's also this idea of the Northern Flower House, which I love, because the government had the Northern Powerhouse. We're going to make the north of England an economic powerhouse. And then the people in the north of Liverpool, and if anyone knows Scousers, they're great. They're like, screw the Tories. What we're going to do is the Northern Flower House, and we're going to take abandoned spaces and plant wildflowers in them. That's a really cool intervention because it doesn't require a lot of ongoing maintenance. However, green walls, green roofs, those things require a lot of maintenance and a lot of money to maintain. So no one really wanted to take ownership of most of the green interventions that we implemented. So they will just be removed. But the EU doesn't, obviously monitor that the project's over. So obviously there's this issue of avoiding the difficult communities. That is the reason that the city gave us as well, is we don't really want to, it's much more difficult to do things in the north, which is generally, especially in the UK where class is still a massive issue. That is, we don't like dealing with the working class in the north of Liverpool. They get very angry at us because they don't trust them. And you already had as well, the mayor ended up getting done on crime charges as well. So things weren't going very well in Liverpool at the time. So we did do our self-assessment, as I said, and inclusive governance, as you can imagine, we did not do well on. Although I will, again, caution you, if you're going to look at some of these, I tried to be as honest as possible. I was probably nicer than I should have been because it's a self-assessment tool. No one actually looks at it. The case studies that are published on nature-based solutions so far, they're all self-assessment. So be skeptical is what I will say. So again, although I talked about how we get a lot of good global press, there's a lot of Scousers are not fooled. Liverpool people are very skeptical around the investment in shiny things, which I call it, like the idea of innovative green things rather than just if you think about that IUCN definition, they should be, if you're inspired by nature, they should be self-organizing systems. They should have some ability to maintain themselves in the absence of human intervention. These are more like designer ecosystems, a lot of them. This is pretty, wild by Liverpool standards, but most of them are quite designed ecosystems. But really what people talk to, because we did a whole bunch of, I should have mentioned, we did surveys, workshops, interviews, lots of events. There's a whole series of things, as you can imagine, over the years that we did this project. They were really skeptical of urban green up. They loved greening and they thought we needed more of it, but they were like, why have you not paid attention to equitable provision of accessible green space, stuff that we can actually use? Why have you not meaningfully engaged us? No one asked us if we thought that a green wall was going to solve all of our problems. Having those interventions at scale. So yeah, people were like, yes, I believe that nature-based solutions work, but they need to be at a much bigger scale. And that does link back to that idea of them being highly designed because they are very expensive. And then kind of pointing to Liverpool and saying, you've not actually changed your policies. We do have some examples where they have changed their policies a bit, but overall, people really felt that the environment was still not elevated on the agenda in Liverpool. And then they're like, you're not even investing in the green spaces that we have. We don't believe that you'll invest in this. But there are bigger issues. I didn't touch on all the other cities, but a lot of those other cities that were the follower cities were actually doing things that are better than what the leading cities were doing. And even in places, well, in every single one of the cities, a lot of this was rebadging of stuff that was already being done. So I already mentioned about the co-production and co-designed with no guidance, resources, or flexibility to do it. We're rebadging existing efforts and calling them nature-based solutions. Remember, though, that those follower cities, if we think about equity at a global scale, the EU is still only investing in the leading cities, which are mostly European cities, and the follower cities are not getting that same level of investment. They hardly get any of the money. And so I think that there's also that contrast between focusing on innovation in the EU, and some of these other cities are doing things that are not necessarily innovative. They're just like building giant green corridors. That's not innovative, but that's probably a lot more effective. And there's also this idea that the EU is using this to kind of, they are trying to be the global leader. And are they kind of trying to expand their global hegemony in Europe and beyond through nature-based solutions? Is this kind of them imposing their view onto the rest of the world and trying to, model their values? Now, we also got another massive 5-year project out of this called Groundswell, where it's actually looking at Edinburgh, Belfast, and Liverpool, and using data to improve public health through urban greening. However, I won't go into it today because it would just be another tangent. But that project, again, really struggled to get engagement from the cities to genuinely co-produce and co-design. However, if you read these things at the bottom, it looks like this is, there's so many co-words. I would recommend looking up Groundswell because we have co-implementation, co-evaluating, co-translating, and there's even more co-words if you go there. But I am deeply skeptical of whether or not they're going to be able to achieve those goals. Now, I'm going to change tactics a bit away from the Urban Green Up project and talk a little bit more about this idea on the whole around urban greening and all of the things that it can achieve. Because again, this is not just something that nature-based solutions has drawn attention to. This systematic review, it's quite old now, actually, it's from like 2010, but it talks about all the things that green infrastructure can do. This is just the selection of those things, you know, increasing your physical activity, improving your cognitive function. Of course, we interact with each other in green spaces, improving air quality, I already mentioned, improving health and well-being, all of these sorts of things, community cohesion, reducing your Alzheimer's risk. There are disbenefits though, of course, like green spaces can increase crime, they can increase allergies and asthma. There's pluses and minuses, but the minuses don't get quite as much attention. But also we're using nature prescribing as a thing. This might not be called nature-based solutions, but it is. It's just as much a nature-based solution as all the shiny stuff I talked about. They're using this in Australia. They use it in the NHS with the idea that it can, I know this is really hard, especially this screen is terrible, especially with my eye injury, I can't see it very well, but it does all of these things for your mental health. And this alone seems like, that list, kind of like I told you, it does for the individual what it can do for the city. And there is really good evidence base that it can do a lot of these things. It's just, there's also a question around who is actually benefiting. So we do know that there are people that do not benefit from green space as much as others. And those are the people who could stand to benefit the most. So that includes ethnic minority groups, older adults, those with deprivation, like the people in the north of Liverpool, those who have disabilities, so they have less access to green space. The perceptions of what constitutes quality green space differs quite significantly, as you can imagine. And there's lots of reasons for that. And that means that they actually end up visiting green spaces less and they receive fewer benefits. So there's a whole bunch of literature on underrepresentation in green spaces, but there's a lot less on examining how identities interact. This is the paper where you can read more about this, and we talk about how you can kind of conceptually do that, how you can understand how people's different identities might intersect to have a more user-centric approach to understanding what quality is. And we know, so for example, in the UK, in England, they have done the People in Nature survey, and before that, the MENE survey, I forget what it stands for at the moment. They've done that for well over a decade, looking at access and use to green space, as well as perceptions of quality. And they consistently find that people from these backgrounds use green space less, and they perceive quality differently. But they don't necessarily qualitatively understand all of the reasons for it. There are studies on it, but it's a lot less studied than the fact that an underrepresentation exists. And it ends up getting simplified into things like, well, we know that people who are in minority ethnic groups might be in parts of the city that have less green space and lower quality green space, which is true. However, there are a lot of different elements to consider, and simplifying it might not actually address some of the issues. So this last little bit I'll talk about is a collaboration with Natural England that we did, funded from the ERC. And they came to us and said, well, we have this, we have all this people in nature data, and we'd really like to do an in-depth exploration of the differences between the way that people perceive green spaces from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And that's where that previous paper actually came out of that project as well. My PhD student, Andrew, is leading that work. And he's looking at, differences in perceptions of quality, use, and the benefits of green space. So there are typical explanations for why these groups are excluded. The idea that they're marginalized, their ethnic and cultural differences, maybe they don't understand what the etiquette is, they're not necessarily haven't grown up using green space, or it could be that there is just outright discrimination. All of these things are documented in the literature, but we wanted to really take a person-centered approach, user-centered approach, to understand how they experience exclusion and how that affects their use and experience of green space. And the idea, of course, is to inform more equitable and accessible green space planning to help Natural England. And we have a very interesting interdisciplinary crew of supervisors on it. So I could do a whole presentation actually on recruitment and the ethics around doing this study, positionality, all of these sorts of things. That a lot of that is going to be in this paper that I'm talking about here. But that was a real adventure. We tried to actually recruit people who did not use green space at all. And we couldn't really find many people who didn't use green space at all. And that's because most of them were using urban green spaces. So Natural England is more interested in the non-urban green spaces because that's what they manage, or that's kind of under their remit. But what we found with the participants that we talked to is that they used urban spaces rather than the countryside, that's how they would refer to it in the UK, because they're in a diverse city. This is in Bristol, which is basically the Liverpool of the South. Some British people might be mad at me for saying that, but that's how I feel. They did not feel excluded in those green spaces. They actually felt like, this is mine. I have a sense of ownership of this. Everyone looks like me. I don't feel different. But when I go out into the countryside, I do feel different. And why do I need to? Kind of Natural England would be like, how do we get you to the countryside to come to the green space? And they'd be like, I don't really want to. I'm quite happy being in my local green space. And especially with the refugee participants that we had, they were like, the green spaces are nice. No one's shooting at me. I feel very safe. This is pretty good. They didn't really have any complaints. Like the Somali refugees were like so happy. They were like, I don't really have any complaints. I don't know what the problem is. And Bristol doesn't have like the most amazing green spaces. I mean, I don't feel particularly inspired by some of their, green, because they would talk about this as a blue corridor in the UK. Definitely doesn't look blue to me, but so there was obviously a lot of people who just also felt comfortable in green spaces because that's what they grew up with as well. But I'll just end on the kind of three forms. So a lot of people did feel like they belonged in green space. But there were kind of three themes that came up in terms of exclusion. And I'm very sorry about the amount of text, but this is the problem with when you want to be genuine with people expressing their own experiences of being in green space. You want their words to speak for them. Yeah. So there's kind of the microaggressions is where you start with. The subtle exclusions, kind of like, oh, you're enjoying yourself? You're here too? Like us people who belong here, I guess is the kind of idea. That was a really common theme. The participants were, kind of said that there's just a lot of subtlety around it, that it was hard to point to necessarily outright racisms, but just a bit of like sort of othering that they felt, or feeling like maybe they were doing something wrong by being there. Another big theme, and that's why I say that, it's kind of like, well, we're happy to be in the urban green spaces. And people would talk about when they do go to the rural places in the UK, the experiences that they get are much more intense than you would get in an urban area in Bristol. So this person talks about, going through this tiny hamlet, a group of white people, maybe in their 50s, all in their barbers with cups of coffee cheering us on. And then one woman called out to me, ooh, we don't see many sorries around here. Which I can definitely hear a British person saying that. Like, I'm sure I've actually heard a British person saying that. And there was also a lot of kind of connection. I won't get into in the paper, we use a lot of like Bordeaux's theories, which we also did in that Compass article. So if you're really into Bordeaux, you can read about that. But there's this idea around how historical practices get embedded into culture and continue into present day. And people really felt that when they were in these rural spaces. So most of the stuff that's considered like countryside in the UK is, left over from the aristocracy owning land, the landed gentry. So they kind of feel like, okay, this is also a space where that same attitude continues, that same class of owners, and just how they are, you know, they've always felt like they're more protected. These are the things that benefit us, and it's not for you. And they just didn't really feel comfortable in those spaces. And the most sort of like, the group with the biggest sense of feeling excluded in this study was the case of Muslim women, because feeling very visibly sign of difference. When we had the microaggressions, it's kind of subtle comments about maybe being darker skin tones and stuff like that. But with Muslim women, they have that, you know, visual marker of their religion. And this person talks about a very really like intense experience with person being very racist, and the kid and her child essentially being like, but it's a park. I want to go on that. Like, why can't I do it? Just not understanding what's happening. And she's like, I don't understand how she could still look me in the eye and be mean to us. And I was like, just ignore her, go on this side of the park. And that's really sad. So there are still, that one was an urban park, yeah. Yeah, in Bristol as well. Like, what are you doing in Bristol then? So to end on a few notes, there are, like, of course, systemic issues that have to be addressed that do relate to this idea of ethnic minority groups and how they experience green spaces. But we also need to kind of understand how those relate to the different identities that people have and their sort of intersection between those, which is what in that article we kind of offer some advice on that, and how you might kind of think about designing spaces where everyone can feel like they actually belong. And that is part of considering quality. We tend to have an idea of quality that is probably a little bit, especially if those of us who work in the environment, that's probably doesn't necessarily include that quality of the user experience, which for them is massive. And also for them, for the participants in that study, a huge element was actually feeling that sense of social cohesion. They felt that in most green spaces in Bristol, but they did not feel that if they went out into the countryside. And so thinking about that in the detailed way that they talked about their experiences and contrasting that with the way that we're seeing nature-based solutions being designed, if we really are going to take the idea of inclusion, all those democratic principles and co-design and co-production seriously, then we need to actually think about those different elements when we design those nature-based solutions. So these are the funding sources for those different projects. If you want to download the data, there's a whole heap of data that, especially the biophysical data, by the way, they barely published anything on it. So if anyone wants to look at that, you should have a look. And does anyone have any questions? Jasper. That's right. That was a very
So I just had a question about inclusive governance.
Yes.
And how that applies in a context like the UK or in Europe, and the extent to which these countries are so-called democratic countries, where you have an elected government, you have representation, you have local councils. To what extent do you think there's an expectation that you need more layers of democracy or inclusive governance, or is that job already being done by the existing democratic infrastructure that you have in those places? And then also, is more participation always, do we always want more participation, or are there limits to actually, you know, do I have to be involved in every single decision that impacts on my like local environment or work environment, or can I delegate that to someone else?
Yes.
Yeah.
You've touched on one of my favorite subjects. So confronting complexity with complexity is what I call it. The idea that, we should, the solution to complex challenges is to make it more complex by including more people. So no, I absolutely do not think that. I think where the problems arise, so I'm going to answer your second question before going to the first. Where the problems arise is that you have to include the people who stand to benefit the most. And those are the people that aren't included in those other forms of governance often. And they're not being included in the design of those interventions. And there are really good examples locally of people self-organizing, like that thing about Northern Flower House, of people self-organizing to actually say what they want. And to be honest, it's more sensible than the stuff that people come up with when they have a whole bunch, because that's part of the problem. They had a whole bunch of money to spend, and so they spent it on stuff that was like shiny and impressive. So I think it's definitely horses for courses. That I do not think, actually, a bunch of those references, I talk about this exact issue about like the confronting complexity with adding complexity in governance. I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think it has to be tailored to what you're trying to do and the people that you include. Like there are reasons for, especially if we're going to take that inclusivity seriously, for engaging the people who need to be benefiting from those nature-based solutions. And then as far as it doing the work at the other levels, I would say, first of all, the EU specifically said to us after the project has already started, you definitely have to co-produce and co-design. And it's riddled throughout all of their paperwork. So they are trying to say that you have to do it in the project. And also it's within the global standard as well, specifically. So they're not viewing it as it's already being taken care of. And then in every one of our cities, there was people definitely had issues with the people that are governing. So in Liverpool, as I talked about, it was basically run by a guy who was doing lots of illegal things. So people didn't really trust them. And there was all this whole history of poor decision making. And the people involved in the project actually had been involved in green space planning over decades. And that's how they knew that if they tried to actually work in the north of Liverpool, that it was going to be harder because they had already undermined their trust. So yeah, hopefully that's an answer.
There's 2 questions online.
Yeah.
Kyle has asked, okay, is this an exercise in political capital building and or design to kind of deflect away from the environment and the economics cost of action?
Economics cost of action.
Yeah.
One sec.
So rather, is it more like a political showcase rather than an actual, we're trying to fix stuff?
Yeah, well, this meeting, which by the way, I'm the only one who understood the brief and wore green to the start of Urban Green Up. Come on, that's why I'm wearing green today. But that was very funny because all the mayors got together and they were all shaking hands and giving each other gifts and then going out and drinking lots of wine. It definitely, there was a lot of that, especially at the beginning. And I do think that that is a big part of it. But they kind of, especially as the project went on, grew increasingly absent from it because they saw that the public didn't really buy it. They weren't buying the green badging. As I said, it was people who were like people outside of the project, and all of these like global publications do tend to promote the project more than, so I think locally it didn't really work if that's what they were trying to do.
There's a question from Andrew Ross. Is analysis of intervention mainly on local impact of single interventions? What work has been done on the large scale impact of specific interventions or groups of interventions?
Yeah, so it was done both, but I would say that the larger impacts were looked at primarily through modeling, but there's a bunch of other stuff that's gone on as well. Like we did this is a separate project, but we had like kind of collaborations with them where we did a sort of natural capital baseline study and then did an analysis of how the Urban Green Up project enhanced the natural capital assets of the Liverpool City region. Then we used that to develop an investment strategy. But yes, we did look at it at a region level, but because they are so small, they didn't really add that much, but they did add something. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question about quality. Sorry, which I think is, such an important, it's in the eye of the beholder. And there's, I guess in the Australian context, it's almost like, brown spaces are kind of more sustainable. And there's some work that was done over at UWA looking at people's preferences around brown parks, that aren't water, that's not watering and other kinds of input, and that being more sustainable, potentially better kind of environmental biodiversity outcomes, and looking at different preferences and whether people still just prefer green parks versus brown parks. And yeah, I guess I just wonder what your perspective is in kind of balancing those multiple values and the trade-offs in navigating things like green spaces or, environmental kind of endeavors in urban spaces.
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I would even intellectually struggle with it. It would be like, intellectually, I know that this is better, but aesthetically, I do not find this is pleasant. I can totally understand that. I think this is where what nature, I think actually the nature-based solutions framing, and we could all argue all day about whether or not we should see nature as a solution and all of that. But I think one of the things about it that's good, if you implement it in the way, I do like the IUCN's approach, is that you're actually thinking about what are the challenges in this particular area that you want to address most, and you're prioritizing those. And so you would look at it, I would think, if you're thinking about a city, over the balance of the urban area, and maybe there are key areas where you prioritize different values than in other areas. And then, of course, we get to the idea of including those stakeholders who stand to benefit the most involved as well. But if I think people can be taken along on that journey, because there are examples of, say, like water-wise verges where people will put in, plants that most people would deem aesthetically not attractive, but they are much better. And as people are, if they're kind of meaningfully brought along into that, you have examples of like entire streets where everyone's like, yeah, we're all doing this, and they get really into it. So I think some of that about the balancing the environmental with the aesthetic and perceptions of quality is probably a little bit of a longer term game of, but like not just telling people this is better for you and you will like it. Did you have a question?
Sarah. Oh,
Yeah.
Sarah. So one aspect of class, and a lot of what you're showing is class
Yeah.
distinctions,
Yeah.
is economic, income, wealth. Nothing in the criteria or your discussion seemed to even mention that. Is it not at all a factor?
Oh yeah, I did mention it. It's where I talk about the disadvantage and deprivation. That's how they talk about it in the UK statistics, level of deprivation. So it's definitely a factor. And then also when I was talking about the north of Liverpool, that is working class Scousers. That's what yeah. So everything about it is about class in the UK, really. I mean, obviously the last part I talked about the minority ethnic communities, but in Liverpool, it's very much class. And yeah, that's why they find it hard. That's, saying those are difficult communities to work with is code for, we don't want to work with the working class Scousers. These lights.
Happens. Just a much broader semantic question. In looking up nature-based solutions in Googling, I just came across all sorts of stuff, controversies about NBS being used to support sequestration in support of climate policy and let emitters and deforesters off the hook. Has that been any kind of disadvantage in kind of just, in some sense, polluting that label NBS in the kind of work you do? Because I can see it sort of being so broadly applied to completely different policy areas that it could get in your way.
Yeah, I do think it is a problem. And that's why I'm always banging on about the principles when I talk about it, because I actually do think that the NBS, the IUCN guidance is solid and the standard is really solid, but it's being used to rebadge everything as this is a nature-based solution. So another one they use for the carbon sequestration stuff you're talking about is natural climate solutions. And there's also the whole moral hazard thing of, you know, you plant a bunch of trees and you're like, that's it. We don't have to change our lifestyle. We've planted all those trees. I am definitely worried about it. And that's where the other day I looked through all of our overseas development aid data as well. And I think we're going to be doing that with, you know, the commitment to how much is it per year, however many billion per year to the less developed countries that we're going to be giving money to. Australia has decided to basically rebadge a lot of its money, saying that this is for climate adaptation, and that I think it is going to be a lot of nature-based solutions. So I am very worried about it.
I would add to that, with the climate adaptation stuff, a real concern that I have. A real concern about over-promising the capacities of the solutions. So I think it's really important that we're using nature in the context of climate adaptation. But if you promise a community that they're going to be safe with a mangrove, and then the storm surge takes the community out, like, you've overpromised the solution and therefore shot its capacity to be used in ways that it's more appropriate. But you've also had a community lose their whatever. So I think that there's, as is always the way with all of these kind of IUCN discourses, this kind of grandstanding and promising of what this is going to deliver. And actually we don't, like you say, have the empirical evidence to show that they like, and from what I've seen, I haven't looked at it for a while, but I did look at it quite a lot. From what I've seen, a lot of the assessments of the climate resilience of some of the interventions was their climate resilience in the current climate, but no projecting forwards to say, okay, this is what the climate is projected to look like in this place in 20 years time. Therefore, the storm surges, for example, are going to be this much more significant. Therefore, your nature-based solution is actually really only going to last you for the next 5 years.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll just very rapidly sum up 2 questions. Kathleen wants to know, basically, the information you learned from the project, are you distilling that down into some sort of usable guides that other cities that want to use it can more easily start their own nature-based solutions?
Yes, there's a whole bunch of guidance that's up, and like we got a project extension that I did not want and I voted against. We got a project extension so we could write some of those. So there's a whole bunch of that on the Urban Green Up website.
Okay. And then the second one is, how common are these efforts in different countries? Like, do you have insight in how these efforts look around the world?
Yes, and there is it's called something like Panorama or something. There's like 1,100 case studies on that website. Again, I would caution you because it's self-reported. All of them are success stories, 1,100 success stories. Yeah, there's good documentation on that. I'm pretty sure it's called Panorama, but is that Kathleen Broderick?
Freya, I'll stop.
Okay, all right. I can email it to you, or you can email me if you want. Yeah. Is that it? Yeah, good. Thank you.